Welcome to KBcast, the podcast for security executives, interviewing people from around the globe on how organizations can operate smarter and stay safer. Here's Carissa Breen.
I recently caught up with Matt Flannery from AINM and we dove into his area of expertise, DevSecOps. We wanted to unpack some of the more nuanced elements of this space. We covered a variety of topics, including incorporating security into a delivery cycle, his approach on how to do this, and some of the gaps that he sees in this space. If you'd like to know more about how Matt can help your organization with DevSecOps, then please keep on listening. Okay, so Matt, I know that we've been trying to coordinate this interview for like 2 or 3 months. I know that you are now a new dad. So
I am.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes. Are you getting sleep?
A little bit.
Yeah, right.
A lot of people accused me of being crazy for wanting to start a business at the same time and having a child, but got to live life on the edge sometimes.
I think throwing yourself in the deep end and then seeing how far you get is the best way to be. It teaches you survival skills. So I really appreciate us doing this interview. I think I actually found out about you 2016, 17. I think it's when you originally started the DevSecOps meetup from memory.
Yes.
I think we were in chat back then.
Yes, that's
right. That's how I knew about what you were doing. So I definitely was keen to get you on the podcast, and as so many times as we missed each other, but super keen to dive into your knowledge on the DevSecOps side. But before we do that, let's talk about your journey. Can you walk me through where you started to what you're doing now?
Okay, so look, I guess I've done a variety of things. I started my career off in network engineering. I moved towards network security. Then I pivoted towards application and infrastructure security. I was consulting for cyber for a good 2 years there, and then found my way into Ticker Tech. And I became their very first DevOps person. I was still very interested in security at that time, so I leaned on my experience to incorporate what I could. And so as early as 2016, I was playing around with things like compliance as code. Trying to implement PCI DSS certification, and the way that we were achieving that was the standard approach of tokenization, reducing the CDE or the cardholder data environment, and that was made a lot easier by leveraging DevOps practices. So I think it was really then at that point that I started to really appreciate, I guess it wasn't called DevSecOps at that point, so whatever it was, I was drawn to it pretty much from then. I looked at who were some bigger players in the market. And I joined a company called Struck Digital. I think it was February 2017. So at the start of 2017, we did a live demo, which pretty much it was a live demonstration of what a hacker would actually do on a typical kind of reconnaissance mission, gathering data about a target and then, trying to probe the application to try and find an issue with it. And so we demonstrated exploiting a vulnerability in an app, and then showed how that it could be detected and remediated using Kibana that we configured as a seam, and Puppet for the configuration management. And so we automatically triggered a patch to patch a box after an attack was detected. So that was in 2017. Obviously, things have changed a lot since then. So I've just been kind of going with it and growing. So I ended up at Deloitte after Struck. They were bought by Deloitte, and so composed the Deloitte DevOps practice at the time. Well, it's probably changed names now, as that organization is crazy big. But yeah, it was probably at Deloitte where I got the most exposure to things like this. So, we were building out CI/CD pipelines that incorporated security, so SAST and DAST and VA. And I developed an automated cloud security assessment tool, which we ran on customer engagements. And it was probably during my experience at Deloitte that I grew the most passionate about this. And so I started the DevSecOps Sydney meetup in start of last year.
Well, I thought it was 2017. I don't know. Every year kind of feels a little bit blurred into the next.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure it was the start of last year, or maybe at the
end of 2017. Yeah, that's probably what it was.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds about right. So yeah, and the reason why I did that was, I really liked public speaking. And I had pretty good feedback about the talks that I gave because they were often live demos and very technical. And I appreciated that because I was trying to do something a little bit different. And so I took a similar kind of philosophy and approach with my meetup. I vet heavily the speakers that are going to talk. We don't just rinse and repeat it every month. If you haven't followed the event closely, it's probably run every 2 to 3 months, actually. Mm-hmm. And the reason that we do that is so that we can, make sure there's high levels of quality and it's not boring. I think the whole meetup things, it can become a little bit daunting as there's just so many of them. So that was...
There is.
Yeah. So I had that in mind and it's been a big success. We get on average like 100 plus people. So doing something, right?
So I think, most people likely listening to this interview are probably intimately familiar with DevOps and even DevSecOps. But just in case, can you give like a helicopter view and then perhaps drill down a bit towards at the coalface?
Yeah, sure. So, look, I think for me, DevSecOps is the logical marriage to, I guess, the last contender in the race of getting an organization's product to market quickly and reliably or securely. Security traditionally, moves slowly due to, for example, Sev1 or P1 outages and various issues, which result in, let's face it, job loss. Mm-hmm. Much like operations, however, unlike ops teams, security teams are pressured to ensure that brand and reputational damage is, mitigated to prevent said organizations ending up in the news, like Equifax, for example. Mm-hmm. So I think DevSecOps is really just an extension of DevOps. If we look at DevOps traditionally, the whole purpose of that was to break down the silos between teams and encourage rapid iteration of products. And the way to achieve that was by implementing certain processes and leveraging tools that made lives easier. And so DevSecOps kind of just is an evolution of that, a natural progression, if you will. However, it tackles issues such as compliance, where if you look at PCI, for example, there's literally a requirement in the DSS that you must have a segregation of duties. And so DevSecOps isn't just about tooling and technology, but it's also about processes and how you can overcome issues like that.
So do you think when you talk about processes, one thing that I've learned in my career is that when we're trying to implement a new process, I think from a behavioral point of view, people don't really like that. So what are some of the hurdles that you've overcome, because this is sort of like a new thing and people in industry can be a little bit on the back foot when something new comes in, they have to adopt to that. Yeah. So keen to get your thoughts on what that was like originally, sort of implementing this within an organization.
Definitely. So it's a pretty interesting question, actually. I guess there's two questions there. So yes, I do think behavior contributes towards, I guess, a bit of a lack of adoption, but there are other reasons too. And yes, it's sort of a new thing, but hey, Docker was sort of a new thing once upon a time. And, I was an early adopter of that in production, and I'm glad because it's kind of now the de facto standard. Mm-hmm. And similarly, DevOps was, not too long ago, it was a buzzword as well.
It was. And then it just becomes part of the furniture. It's like everyone arcs up about it, and then it just becomes a new normal thing. Yeah. Look, it's one of the hottest skills in the market, undeniably, right now, DevOps. And so DevSecOps is it used to only really be something I heard about when people came to my meetup. Mm-hmm. And 2 years ago, I considered it to be a bit of a buzzword, to be honest. But now it's being adopted as a practice within organizations. Enterprises and mid-market companies and startups alike are all talking about it, and they're all asking the question of how to achieve it. And look, I guess there are a few different drivers. For example, a lot of organizations are starting to slowly pay attention more so if like audit requirements are present, such as NIST or PCI or APRA or whatever. And to extend on what I was talking about with DevOps, another driver is just the natural progression of DevOps itself to incorporate security. When these DevOps programs and bodies of work are getting implemented,
the security team members and security experts within organizations are kind of scratching their head thinking, okay, well, now my job's 1,000,000 times harder because you're releasing into production 1,000 times a day. And so security needs to start to become incorporated within the software development life cycles, within application delivery pipelines where it makes sense. And by employing a well thought out DevSecOps program of work, you can achieve that.
So can you define, when you say what makes sense, what do you mean specifically when you say that?
Sure. So look, one of the issues, probably the biggest issue I've seen is people are trying to run before they can walk. So, what I mean by that is if you're not even doing DevOps, how are you supposed to incorporate security into a DevOps program? I think there are a lot of gaps, and it's based mainly on old world thinking that security is a bit of a silo.
Yes.
And so as long as teams responsible for the creation of code, the delivery of code, and the sticking to approved user access and network rules and whatever else, many of them think that, nothing is wrong. You and I both know that that's simply not the case. And,
yes.
I've seen it in the real world. Many non-security teams consider SIEM as acceptable, whilst any security professional will tell you, well, that's simply the start. Once you have visibility over your data, you need to do something with it. Probably another issue, which is more interesting from a security lens, is the lack of contextual understanding as well. So, for example, how security issues or risks actually affect application development and infrastructure operations. And I can drill into a bit of an example here recently. I was working with a customer and they walked us through the Agile processes that they are using internally. For example, very early on in their feature planning stage, they're incorporating this checklist, right? It's just like best practices, like a list of tick boxes that they're trying to appease. And look, the OWASP top 10 is great and all, but that doesn't help you understand any of the contextual risks that may be associated with a feature or a particular product release. For example, something as seemingly innocent as a favicon or a QR code could have, implications.
Let's drill down a little bit more on the DevSecOps thing. So what's your experience, the things that you'd change, things that you'd do again, and the thinking behind those decisions, considering you've done this in a range of organizations, you've been at it at the inception stage of it. So I'm really keen to get your opinion and your advice to see how that whole paradigm has shifted over time.
I personally believe that traditional DevOps is, if not already dead, it's on the way out. And there's a huge focus on things with great security implications that are contributing to this. So, for example, take IoT, right? This means more connectivity, more threats, more attacks. And if a kid with a credit card can spin up, multiple gigabytes of connectivity and DDoS a small country for days, knock it off the internet, well, what does that say about the current threat landscape? And just like the threat landscape, DevSecOps itself has evolved too. You're right. At the start of 2017, in February or March, I did this presentation, right, where we showed a live demo of typical recon techniques and demonstrated the exploitation of a vulnerability in an app in real time and how that could be detected and automatically remediated. Now, we used a bunch of different tools. Don't need to go into them, but now we're seeing a lot in the container security space, like real-time application security, etc., runtime application security. And we're seeing more and more security being baked within an application development and delivery process, which is pretty exciting. And I don't just mean, plugging in Nessus or Acunetics or Burp Suite into a CI/CD pipeline and calling it done. People are starting to think about how security can fit much earlier on in the application lifecycle. So, for example, threat planning at the very beginning of feature planning, and that's proved to be effective in some cases. As application architecture, delivery, and cloud has, I guess, rapidly changed in the last 3 to 5 years, so is security. Let's face it. All of the major vendors are now looking to get in on the cloud security and the DevSecOps train, and as a result of that, we're seeing some pretty huge M&As. This makes life interesting, certainly. And it's a good example of how the ecosystem is constantly evolving and changing. To emphasize that, actually, I made a little infographic recently on LinkedIn where I attempted to categorize like various tooling, right, and help paint a picture of what the DevSecOps ecosystem currently looks like. Now, I made that less than a month ago, and I'd probably already need to change it dramatically.
Whoa, okay.
I think just a lot of planning and vision early goes a long way. We've been, some of our customers, for example, we've been working to implement some pretty innovative solutions, if I may say so myself, such as CI/CD pipelines that bake in security and implement systems that continuously test applications post their deployment, as well as implement processes and frameworks around agile delivery, which make a lot of sense from a security standpoint, and it incorporates it in an effective way.
So do you think people struggle with vision? You mentioned just before appropriate planning and vision.
Yeah.
Do you think that's something that a lot of people still aren't sort of grasping and not really taking into consideration?
Look, I think there's a lot to consider in regards to that. I mean, CISOs, for example, have budgets. They have a lot of risks. They don't want their company to end up on the news, right? So they're already doing very careful planning as it is. Let's face it, otherwise they wouldn't be in those roles. I just think that, there's so much that you need to consider that it's just getting to the point where in many cases, you need to bring in a team of experts to help. It's the infographic thing that I just mentioned. That's a good example. If the ecosystem is so rapidly changing and evolving and, the latest and greatest tool that you thought solved your problem is now redundant in a week's time, how can you possibly keep up with that?
You can't. It's hard.
You can't. And so the simple answer is careful planning to, standardize on a core set of tools and implement them in a meaningful way. That's going to set you up for greater success than even trying to keep up.
One of the things you said then that I find interesting, that obviously within a week things could be redundant, which is very true. Do you think people need to be more aware that they need to know, I don't know this, but hey, this Matt Flannery dude knows and his team knows? Do you think there's still a naivety there around, we've got Jennifer, who's our appointed DevSecOps chick, but she's not necessarily really got a finger on the pulse? Do you think that people just not quite there yet? Like, they have this idea that they've got someone internally, but like you said, they might not necessarily have their finger on the pulse to your level, so to speak.
And look, that's fine. I'll shamelessly plug what we've been doing so far, as it's been pretty effective. We've worked with a lot of customers who are trying to take on these initiatives themselves. And so to support that, actually, we developed a bit of a framework called the A&M DevSecOps Maturity Assessment Model. And it's something that we developed primarily to help businesses align real metrics with, their various implementations so that they can tangibly measure technology, processes, and get some meaningful results. So, for example, that DevSecOps maturity model that I just mentioned, it evaluates things like, the customer CI/CD, or individually their CI and their CD, their testing, their security hygiene, the developer culture, and so forth. And so far, the clients that we've worked with using this assessment model have all further engaged us to lead and implement initiatives. Organizations could, of course, look at developing their own model, and some do. However, I just think we've spent a lot of time perfecting this to provide a meaningful gap analysis, and some really awesome recommendations often are coming out of it. So I can personally recommend that. But on the flip side, there's no reason why customers can't do that themselves or something similar. As I said, it all goes back to the careful planning, right? If you just look at your organization without bias and look at where the gaps are, it's only when you understand where the problems lie that you'll be able to come up with a roadmap for resolving them, right?
So let's talk about gaps. Where do you believe the gaps are in this space at the moment?
So, look, I kind of touched on this earlier. I think that probably the biggest gap is just in education and understanding. Security is a really strange industry.
Define really strange, though.
Look, I think that a lot of people are just trying to jump onto the DevSecOps bandwagon right now with not a lot of understanding as to what it actually means. Or
That's what they always do. The next level, the AI, machine learning.
Yeah, totally. So as a real world example, I mentioned this before. We were very recently, as early as 3 weeks ago, sitting in workshopping with a customer, and they walked through, their Agile SDLC. So they walked us through their CI/CD pipeline. They walked us through, how something gets from an idea to code on a laptop and deployed to production through that entire process. And so one of the things that we found really interesting is that this particular customer was using a bit of a checklist at the start of their feature planning process, and all features that were being developed post commit as well had to marry up this checklist. The thing that was interesting though about those two individual checklists is that, well, they were actually different. And so I think that could become confusing for a developer in some cases, because, which one do they follow, right? And so that's what I mean about the lack of understanding. Even though you're having this, it might be the greatest checklist in the world. It doesn't really matter. All it's really trying to do is look at, some very basic things like, is your data sanitized? Is there an SSL cert on this domain? Whatever the checklist is, it doesn't actually look contextually at the application or the feature you're developing. So, for example, favicon is a very, very interesting one to use because it seems entirely innocent. However, as we saw recently, there are issues with that. And so I think that it's really important to consider that. That's probably one of the biggest gaps. It's just that development teams just don't have the experience. They don't know what to look for. And that's not a reflection on their training or education, because in my personal opinion, it's better to take a blank slate and train them up anyway. It's just one of the contributing factors. Behavior within organizations is a bit of another one. Before DevOps was as widely adopted as what it is today, there was a lot of contention between development and operations teams. No one would put their hand up and try and help the other person. It would just be like, yep, that's not my job, and move on with their other tasks. Security is kind of the same issue. And I've seen this before. A developer will ask a question to a security guy and he'll be like, hey, what do I do with this? And he'll say, okay, here's, my suggestions and recommendations, and you should do this and shouldn't do this. And, I've literally seen it happen more often than not, where that developer or dev team will walk away and say, nah, we're not going to do that. That's going to take way too long.
Heard that before.
And so I think that behavior needs to change, and DevSecOps is a way to support that change. Mm-hmm. It's one thing to implement specific tooling in a CI/CD pipeline, or, implement systems that do things to monitor your applications and test your applications. It's another to integrate them tightly with your development processes. And I don't just mean, IDE plugins. I literally mean having a bit more consciousness around security itself. So the feature planning thing is a really good one. In that particular scenario, it very well may make sense to have a security, guy there present talking about the kinds of contextual risks associated with those individual features, right?
Because in my experience, like working in large enterprise myself, I've seen this behavior, and one of the things that I find is really interesting that I've spoken to many people about. So you spoke about developers. Obviously, they don't necessarily have the context because that's not what they teach you when you are learning engineering, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things is you sort of spoke about before, like old mate goes over the security guy, he's like, nah, stuff that guy. I'm going to do my own thing anyway. Because they're really building for functionality, not necessarily for security reasons. And I think one of the things that I took out of that example that you used was probably how security people are delivering what they're saying they need to do to make it secure is probably in a very rigmarolled, roundabout way that looks quite overwhelming then.
Yes.
And so maybe there's this disconnect even on the security end that it's like, yeah, cool, I really get what you're having to say. And I've even seen in my experience when you've got an architecture team, you've got a development team, it's like, yeah, cool. So I've just been handed this from the architect and that looks crazy. Like I'm basically not going to build it how they've designed it. Mm-hmm. So I've seen a lot of that behavior as well. So I'd like to get your opinion on how, so use that example before, Dev tries to do the right thing, asks the security guy, he's given him something that probably is a bit overwhelming, doesn't quite get it, and he's gone stuff that. How would you advise someone how they should approach it to get the outcome of the developer implementing the security that the architect or whoever has recommended?
That's a really good question. And I think the simple answer is just better collaboration and more rapid iteration, probably in smaller chunks in a lot of cases. So, for example, if you can provide your developers with rapid feedback on finding, either bugs or flat out vulnerabilities in logic, not just a package is out of date and has some RCE, if you can rapidly provide that feedback during the development lifecycle back to the developers, it's going to be more digestible for them. And thankfully, with the advent of things such as, CI/CD and the various technologies and tooling around that, security engineering teams, as in the ones that develop tools, are developing tools to fit into those pipelines. And so rather than waiting, a few months for a pen test and then getting the results, we're now starting to see security fit within the application lifecycle, so much so that devs can release code from their laptop and then, an hour or so later get feedback or even less, depending on what it is, obviously, get feedback around, what they could be doing better from a security standpoint. And I think that's one of the things that's really going to help there. Probably the other thing is just communication. It pays
how you deliver your message. Yeah. Not by undermining the developer. Very smart dude, just doesn't have the context.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's a valid point because I've seen that a lot too.
You and me both. So that sort of moves me to my next question. What do you believe is on the horizon for this space? Like, what's the future look like? And what do you think is going to evolve and the roadmap looking forward? Because I guess it is still a new behavioral change that we spoke about. It is kind of new, but what do you think will end up happening over time?
Yeah, so when I first started exploring this beast, I thought it was around things like helping organizations to achieve compliance easier. So using some kind of configuration management tool to ensure that operating systems were configured with specific hardening guidelines that are compliant with whatever checklist, such as NIST or PCI or whatever. And instead, it took a totally different change and it's focused more into AppSec. Along that journey, there was still a lot of focus on infrastructure security. So, for example, the ability to smash a box and rebuild an environment rapidly and test a recently redeployed application that's been patched in a standalone isolated environment for the purpose of system integration and functional testing. And now, now that there have been some good examples of that in the real world, the focus is shifting entirely to AppSec. And I think that's good because so has the technology landscape as well. There's less of a focus on infrastructure from a development standpoint and a deployment standpoint. The introduction of Docker images certainly contributed to that and other technologies such as serverless. And so I see it continuing down that path. And I've tried my best to keep up as well. We've delivered some very cool solutions, which, not only take advantage of the kinds of technologies that are available, but implement them in a sensible way. So, for example, take a CI/CD pipeline of yesteryear where you develop, a Node.js and test it with, say, SonarQube and then deploy it through various environments and promote it when the app hits staging. You don't need to call the security guy to run some vulnerability analysis from Nessus or Acuinetics. You can just press a button now. So things like that are really, really helping to sculpt the direction. And it's pretty exciting.
I'd say like another thing as well would be it'll fast track things to go live as well. In my experience,
Totally.
You run a whole project and like you said, you call old mate up the security guy, do a test. You've got all these problems and cool. We now can't go live. Everyone starts arguing. Totally. I've been in those meetings. You've got senior people who've got no clue what they're signing off because of the risks that you've identified. Are you sure? Yes, we'll go ahead. And then it becomes a political play then, and it actually then becomes less about this security. I've been there at the coalface myself, some of these meetings, and there's literally like 50 people in these meetings. You got like the service owner, the production manager, this other dude, the developer, and you've got all these people that are looking at you that are stressed because you're like, well, can't go live with this. So I think over time it'll actually help expedite all of these projects going live and not holding them up. And it costs a lot of money, right? Because at the end of a project, you've got no money left. And then when you've got to pay internal security teams that are upwards of 200K plus because of all the testing and stuff, that's when it gets really awkward because then their project can't go live. And a lot of these project managers probably contractors, they're getting KPI'd on their go live dates, and then you're prohibiting them. And then it just becomes like, oh, well, we hate you guys are the police. And so that's a change that I'm seeing with talking to people as well in industry, and the things that I've seen in my own career about that that awkward security thing at the end, and then there's a big blow up.
Yeah. Look, you're totally on the money, and that's a big driver for us. That's a major reason why I see a lot of value in delivering the services that we're now doing, and it's in that rapid iteration, And if we go back to what I said earlier, where taking the example of the developer who goes to the security team, and there's all of a sudden there's these massive roadblocks. If you can minimize those roadblocks, as in still provide feedback back to developers, but do it in smaller chunks quickly, rather than here's a huge report, spend the next 10 months fixing all these problems. You need security to line up with the speed of development. Put simply, that is one of the biggest drivers for DevSecOps. And that's where some of our customers are probably getting the most value. It's being able to, as I said, iterate on products quickly, rapidly, and most importantly, deliver them reliably in a secure fashion. The advent of continuous security testing within a production software pipeline, as some simple examples like SonarQube for SaaS testing, running Burp Suite Enterprise to actually fuzz an application, or a specific feature of an application, Metasploit, Nessus, Qualys, Acuinetics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can plug all of these tools in now. And just like you wouldn't configure a SaaS tool to run around the entire code base of an application each time you're making a PR, just run it on small chunks, run it on what you're actually working on. Still do the other larger testing, but do it out of band. We've been working pretty closely with another security company called Deloitte here in Australia to not only architect pipelines like this, but also provide a managed SaaS layer on top of that, which has proven to be pretty interesting. So we'll see where that goes. But, they're the kinds of things that you need to start considering in order to be able to have security keep up with the speed of development.
Okay, rapid fire, 5 things you can suggest to an organizations after now listening to this interview that they can implement.
Sure. So probably what I just said.
I was just going to say, now you have to repeat what you said.
Yeah. So 5 things. Okay, cool. So look, to start off, you need the basics. Familiarity with best practices from public cloud providers. If you're in the cloud, and all of these providers have a security section, become familiar with them. Often none of these are followed, which is shameful to see. It's just shameful to see. And it's not just internal people that are responsible for this. I've had to come in and pick up the pieces from other consultancies, and I won't, name names. I'm not in the business of that. But if you can't implement these bare minimum practices, which are realistically the foundational building blocks that you need, how can you plan on building out more advanced capabilities? So I'd start there. Another thing is understand where you are before you start thinking about where you want to be. Going back to that whole organizations and people, hell, I'm even guilty of this in the past. A lot of people want to try and run or sprint before they can walk or even crawl. And so that's one of the reasons why I came up with the assessment model to evaluate how mature not only DevSecOps but also DevOps bodies of work are, because I really think it's important to help businesses understand, where they actually are at in terms of not only technology or tools, but also the processes that they're using around software delivery, and also, the people. Culture is a big issue. That's probably 2. 3, it's not going to hurt to get, some incentive-driven training for developers and staff on, say, CTFs or bug bounties. A lot of people have had some good and bad success with platforms such as Secure Code Warrior, Pen Tester Labs, probably one of my favorite ones. There's no reason why staff can't do these types of things in their own time. But hey, if it's incentivized, like a competition or something, that's going to be pretty interesting to people. And part of what we do, as in A&M, is people and process-based education. There's a lot of talk about security shifting to the left and a shared responsibility model between devs and security team members alike. And so I think it's important to actually frame that. Another thing, as a dev, the security guys aren't going to bite you. They don't bite. Go and spend a little bit of time with your red team or your blue team if you can. I'm sure it will be valuable. And I guess finally, a benchmark evaluation from a team of experts experienced in the field helps a lot too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for reiterating those points again.
No problem.
Just an easy way for people to sort of get a recap of the things that you've sort of talked about. So I really appreciate you sharing your story, your insight, your knowledge. If people want to reach out to you, how can they go about doing that?
I'm available on LinkedIn, obviously. You can contact me there, or alternatively, hit our website up. My email is matthew@anm.com.au, and I will happily field any questions. I also run the DevSecOps Sydney meetup, so you can find me there. And stay tuned, because there is an event upcoming soon where we may be doing a prize giveaway, so that'll be fun.
Incentive driving yet again.
There we go, see? People need to be scored and they want incentives.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Matt. I'm so glad that we finally got around to doing the interview. And I did learn a lot of things from you today, and I'm sure our listeners did as well.
I'm really glad to hear that. I think it went well. It was really lovely to talk to you, Carissa.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for tuning in. As always, we hope you got some new ideas or ways of thinking from this episode. And remember, you can always reach out to our guests if you do have more questions. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast, and we always love to hear your feedback. So leave a review on iTunes and we might just give you a shout out on a future episode. You can find me on LinkedIn as well as on @IamCarissaBreen on Twitter and Instagram. And if you'd like to know more about how we help tech companies, check out carissabreenindustries.com. Until next time, stay safer.